7:30. This is the way it should be, because normally if you wait for people to come that are going to show up late, you're punishing the people who are punctual. This way, if you
the door right now.
All right. Oh, what is this here? Oops, a little too much. What happens is that the end of the board here is wrong direction. Are we getting sound right? Yes, everything. Yes, all right. This is a funny, funny world. What did I do here? All right, finally we're ready. In the preceding talk yesterday, we tried to get an overall view of the spirit-matter pole in this very terrible diagram. It's very helpful, but it's not really representative. Now, the talk yesterday, or the first talk, was very sketchy, and it was very fast. The spirit-matter pole is so grand, and it's so deep that it's difficult to understand it comprehensively. I apologize for not really having the capacity to communicate that kind of splendor and that kind of majesty that is the spirit-matter pole. If I could, I would be an outright adept. Now, our spiritual growth is so little and it's so slow that it's things like this that makes one feel ashamed of how little development one has. Hopefully that pang of inadequacy is the thing that drives us to strive more ardently. If we can't share the thing that is most beautiful to us, that should be something that drives us. Now, there were actually some things that were practical to living efficient spiritual lives, though in that talk the practicality was not overtly stated. One thing that was stated was that in the spirit-matter pole, that as one ascends, there's greater subtlety and concurrent power. That's very helpful. For example, if we know that thought is more subtle than desire, we should be able to, by right thinking, be able to control our lower nature. And that's what it's all about, is being able to control that so that the spirit is in charge rather than the false ego or the second ego. Appealing to the spirit beyond the mind invokes a still greater power. If we look to that transcendent, it's certainly equal to any task. That's what it's all about, bringing the spirit into matter, becoming whole people in the way that the whole of the spirit-matter pole is within us, alive within every atom of our physical body. Another valuable realization in studying the spirit-matter pole is that that was also not explicitly stated, is that our nature is basically spiritual. It is the threefold spirit that is focused in the self. That is our true nature. We're not the personal beings. The personal being is a very limited form that is important to the development of the spirit, but basically we are spiritual beings. We are divine. As our Lord said it, know ye not that it is written, ye are gods. With a small g, of course. If we live according to that knowledge, we certainly don't have an inferiority complex. And it's very helpful to self-realization if we know that what we were from the beginning and will be at the end is a divine being. That we keep our consciousness set on that, we're more likely to attain. It's also practical and attitude improving to know that the limits of this world, the chemical subdivision of the physical world, are really benign. By working through and with limitation, we gain objectivity and we gain a very definite perspective. It's a relief to know that we don't have to chafe at the seeming obstructions of the world, but by accepting them and working through them, we can do wondrous things. This is something that's true to artists, painters. Some painters have said, if you can paint something with 5 paints, do it with 4. They knew that it would bring something out of the painter to accomplish in that way. That's a real appreciation for limitation. And yet another thing from the preceding talk that is exceedingly important to developing spiritual faculties is the understanding of withinness, which is going to occupy us quite a bit this evening. Living in the limited physical world with exclusive and excessive outwardness, we have almost no consciousness of inwardness. That's one of the very sad tragedies of the fall into matter. It has brought us into an attitude that reality and truth are without, that the truth is in the matter and not within. We've done that for so many rebirths now, and we are so materialistic and exterioristic that it has become a bad habit to us. Our consciousness is fixed in that attitude. So it is to our advantage to know that the truth is within and that the greater reality is within. Clairvoyance, which is an inner perception, is not accomplished in the same way that vision is accomplished. Seership is direct and inward. Again, our Lord says, the kingdom of heaven, which is the spiritual worlds, is within. That's one of the most important statements for spiritual students from the biblical Christ. Learning to trust in that inwardness in ourselves and working with it, or even just trying to work with it, does a great deal for our progression on the spiritual path. Now, these are just a few sketchy examples of practical and efficient living spiritually from the subject of that talk. There are many, many more. In fact, at one point, I thought of having all of the talks be offshoots of that initial talk. And that would be fine, and maybe someday I'll be able to do that. But other thoughts came into mind, and I realized more and more, like Bertrand Russell said, you can be aware of aging, but you can't do anything about it. And I realize more all the time that I'm approaching the end of my career as a speaker for this lifetime. And there are a lot of things I'd like to try and a lot of things that I'd like to go into that I haven't tried yet. So it's important that we don't get stuck in seeing and doing things in only one way. It might, for your own study, be worthwhile to look into the basic outline of the talk yesterday and use that as a means for discovering for yourself practical things that can accelerate your spiritual life. So, we don't want to get stuck. That's what materialism is. It's just a very bad attitude about the nature of reality. We have taken for granted that what we see outside of us is reality, the greater reality, and what it means or what is meaningful to us. So we're going to try to do different things for the remainder of these talks. Please bear with me because some of the things I'm going to try are a little bit different. But for now, let's get back to the topic. Now, if I look back at the content and the delivery of the talk yesterday, I find ironic humor. The talk is guilty of the very thing it rails against, materialism. Meister Eckhart says, one does not see God with the same eyes with which one sees a cow. And you can't talk about God in the same way that you talk about sticks and stones. Our Lord in the Gospel says, I speak to you in earthly words and you don't get it. So how do you expect to get it if I speak to you in heavenly ways? So in some ways, it was almost comic to speak of the structure of the spirit-matter pole in terms of flagpoles and shelves with long arms and things like that. You get a little bit of a laugh at yourself when you do that kind of thing. Of course, when you do that, you get some simple ideas across, but what you missed is the august and sublime grandeur of it all. Those things that you really can't even put into words, it should at least be an effort to try to bring them in. So they may have appealed to the concrete mind and in some small way to the spirit, but basically they edged on being profane. Now, I'm not sure that I even have the capacity to carry through and convey that grandeur. Therefore, it's up to you folks to take the material inward and to follow it up to see whether it's true and how it can be helpful to you. It's always like that. Now, the outward presentation never lives up to inward experience. And as our temple service says, we see the unprepossessing exteriors of others and of the world. Now there are other more mundane ways that the preceding talk missed the mark for some people. The presentation was not like what we have in mind when we talk about polarity. Normally when we think of polarity, we think of something active. We think of the two poles of a bar magnet, or we think of the two poles, the anode and cathode of a battery. We usually don't think of heaven and earth when we think of polarity. Now, the discrepancy is mostly a matter of experience or the lack of experience. Nonetheless, there is a spiritual principle behind the difference. Why polarity is, when we think of it, is different than the spirit-matter pole. In that talk yesterday, we spoke of different states of being along the spirit-matter pole, and those states of being are called worlds. Each world has its own principles and its own purposes, and each world has a specialization. And they are all unified and parallel with each other because they're all part of the universal spirit. And the universal spirit carries through by the principle of analogy. Now, the world of divine spirit is a world of invisible power. And the world of life spirit is a world of spiritual light that is bright according to the spiritual power of the divine spirit that is within it. Or as our Lord says in St. John's Gospel, to know me is to know the Father. Now, the world of concrete thought has its specialization in that it is a world of pitch or a world of tone. And the desire world is a world of color, while the physical world is a world of form. So there is a specialization in each world, even though there are characteristics of every world and every other world. It's the specializations and the accentuated specializations that differ the worlds from each other. Now, the people that live, or the denizens that live in each world, have specialized services that they offer. Everything in the cosmos serves. Everything in the cosmos is useful. The chemicals in the chemical subdivision of the physical world serve by providing stable form. They even provide predictable results from their interactions. There's a kind of stability in the minerals. The vegetables serve by specializing etheric energy from the sun. All the creatures that, the humans and the animals need that service from the vegetables, because we have to have the etheric vitality either directly or indirectly in order to continue living. So we owe that to the animals. The creators are in the ethers, so that the angels actually direct the flows of energy in the etheric subdivision of the physical world. The animals, in their species ideas or their species qualities, focus the desire qualities in the desire world. Astrologers know that the word zodiac means circle of animals. And each animal species or group of animal species has a distinct attitude, desire world attitude. And they are carrying those things out, or they are carrying them into the world. In fact, they even do that, provide that for humans. There are some humans, I remember when I worked at the post office, what happened, I was working with a woman, and I was very enthusiastic about astrology, and we used to talk with each other as we were sorting mail. And I looked at the woman sitting next to me, and I said, "You must be Aries because you have a face that looks just like a chicken." And everybody laughed, and everybody thought it was true, but she didn't feel very good about it. It was a time that it would be best to have been keep my mouth shut. We as humans are the only beings in the concrete worlds, especially the physical world, the chemical world, that are focused in the world of thought. So our service is to bring thought. So when we have people like chemists and physicists and people like that are thinking about the world, they're doing more than just discovering principles that work in the world. What they're doing is they're bringing human self-consciousness to the world, and that's a really valuable service. That's as valuable as knowing the laws themselves. Now, a few minutes ago we said, and we also said in a talk preceding this, that each world has its own specialization. As it turns out, some worlds seem to have more peculiar specializations than others. The world of life spirit, for instance, is the first world when proceeding upward on the spirit matter pole that is so inward that it in effect has no without. It is totally within, so it is totally objective. It has no actual without as we know the without. So that when you know Christ in the life spirit, you know Christ not just in a form, you know Christ in total. The life spirit is reflectively projected into the etheric subdivision of the physical world. We mentioned that the life spirit is as far away from the lens mirror as the etheric subdivision is from the other side of the lens mirror. So there is a reflective projection. And that produces a peculiarity in the etheric subdivision of the physical world. I've lost myself in my notes here. The chemical subdivision of the physical world has its own peculiarity. And its peculiarity, in a way, is the inverse of the life spirit. As we experience it, the chemical subdivision of the physical world has no within, as we understand withinness from spiritual perception. If we take an object, say a potato, we see only the without. If we want to see what is within, we can cut it open. But if we do that, we don't see what is within. We just see two new withouts, according to the way we cut it. Now, we could take an X-ray of the potato, and that would sort of give us something like a within, but we would be shifting from the physical world, where senses are reflective, to the ethers themselves and not really to the chemicals. We could make a plexiglass potato, which would be an interesting thing to do. And we could see light passing through it, but we could not see the within that is the spiritual within. And this is because in the physical world, there is no within. At least not a within that is like the within that we experience in the inner worlds, or what we call the inner worlds. Now, neophyte clairvoyants have to expand their consciousness in order to understand what they're seeing, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Now, suppose, for example, you're clairvoyant, and you're clairvoyant in the desire world, and you see someone in their aura, it requires an adjustment. On one hand, one sees the physical body, and in the desire world, one sees the aura. Now, they seem to occupy the same dimensional space, but something is different. It's very different from what we see with our physical eyes. Now, you understand when this is happening, you understand that those two things, the visual and the clairvoyant, are connected and that they're part of the same reality. You understand that, but it requires an adjustment in consciousness to see what the connection is. And the relationship is inward. And the inward dimensional understanding has to be supplied by the consciousness of the clairvoyant. Like animals are just the opposite. If you go down the street with your car and you're going along Monona Bay over here, the ducks have an inward vision, and they don't understand cars at all. And many of them will run right into your car because they don't see that in the same way. The car doesn't have an inner aura. But if you're going down the street with a bicycle, the ducks can see it. They know what's going on. They see it. They see something there that, with their inner vision, that they can see that this is it. So the understanding or the adjustment is within the clairvoyant. Now, a lot, even of very famous clairvoyants, when they first opened up their clairvoyance, would close their eyes. Because when they would close their eyes, then they would have only the desire world perception, and they wouldn't have to make that adjustment. Eventually, they do learn to make the adjustment to see that the two worlds that they're seeing, one with withoutness and one with withinness, they learn how to make the adaptation in their consciousness. We do a lot of those things like that every day. I do it every day when I take my hearing aids out. I hear differently, and I have to make an adjustment. I've only had the hearing aids about a month now, and I'm still making adjustments in my brain to understanding the sounds that I'm hearing through the hearing aids. So, the desire world, what is more important, the desire world and all the higher worlds beyond the desire world, the withinness is more than the withoutness. There are external forms in the desire world, and those external forms do have some meaning, but they're not as important as the inner meaning of that is producing those forms. In fact, clairvoyants are taught to not have illusions. When they get something in their vision, they're told to hang on to it until they can see the inwardness of it and not just be fooled into looking at the illusory exterior. So the desire world and all of the higher worlds are much more dynamic. They're much more lively. They're much more capable of force than things are, and when they're manifest in the chemical subdivision of the physical. The chemical subdivision is relatively inert. You might even say that this world is dead, at least in comparison, because everything changes so suddenly in the desire world that it takes a really steady consciousness that approaches like what we call slow motion or stopped action motion in this world. Now, because of the grossness and the inertness, it is unlikely that the chemical subdivision interpenetrates another world beyond this one, going down on the spirit matter pole, at least as far as we humans understand it and the way we experience it. I suppose this could interpenetrate something else, but it would have to be awfully dense, and I don't think that means dark matter the way the physicists think. All right, chemical subdivision for us is definitely the bottom of the spirit matter pole. It's the end of the line of the manifest cosmos. It is, so to speak, dead. The creation in this is carried out to the very last detail. We carried the chemical subdivision too deeply into concretion by our fall. And we've lost the inward vision that would have tied it all together, and we wouldn't have to be in ignorance making all these silly mistakes that we make. but we have to redeem the world that we have brought into too great of materialization. It has to be brought to life. And this is one of the activities of the ethers. The within has to be brought into and through that, and that is one of the activities of the ethers. Because this deepest state of matter has to be spiritualized. If by no other means, by taking it into our bodies and spiritualizing it with our consciousness. And the essence of the chemicals, this deepest state of matter, has to be conveyed into the spirit. And this is another side of the work of the ethers. Now from this we can see that much of the work of the ethers is conveyance. Conveyance from things in the inner worlds to the outer world, and things from the outer world back into the inner worlds. This is so clear and apparent to mystics that some of the early mystics and even some current mystics think that the only function of the ethers and the ethers in the vital body is conveyance. The Rosicrucian philosophy is modern, and the investigators of the Rosicrucian philosophy have found that the higher ethers, the light and the reflecting ethers, which are called soul ethers, constitute an important vehicle of consciousness. Because if we don't have enough of the soul ethers, we cannot carry our consciousness, waking consciousness, into the spiritual worlds. We're awake in the spiritual worlds in between lives, but we're not awake in the same way that we're awake here. It's marvelous what we do, but it's not the same thing as being self-consciously awake. Being here is an exceptional privilege. The opportunity to awaken here is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity that can't be done anywhere else. We know clearly that right now this is the only place that we can develop conscious soul. And without conscious soul, you're not going to develop consciousness. That's just as clear as it is. Now, to accomplish the work of energizing the chemicals and vitalizing the chemical physical body obviously requires a very strong charge. Because the subtle qualities, the lively qualities of the higher worlds are wonderful, but it's like they literally run into a brick wall when it comes to the chemicals. And that charge that is required to bring the effects of the inner worlds into the outer world is what we understand as polarity. And that polarity is strong and it is distinct. There are things that approach polarity in other worlds, but the polarity that we know from the in the ethers, as we experience it here especially, is unique. So this is why when we think of polarity, as we commonly experience it, we're thinking of etheric polarity. Etheric polarity between the within and the without. The etheric polarity is sort of like a microcosm of the grand spirit matter pole. But it is a distinctly specialized microcosm. Because, all right, so for most of the rest of the talk, we're going to be talking about the ethers and the etheric body and the polarities and how they work. Now, the investigators of the Rosicrucian order, primarily the adepts, have found that there are 4 etheric regions in the macrocosm and microcosm of the etheric world and the human body, the human etheric body. Other schools of investigation have found the same thing, but some of them have given different names. And from what I've seen, even some of them, I can think of 2 other schools of Christian mysticism that have different names, and each one of those names helps you to understand quite clearly the nature of the ethers. Rod Lakes, who talked this afternoon, and I have been reading a lot of the Cypriot mystic Daskalos, and he's clearly an initiate in the John tradition, but he sees things differently, and it's valuable the way he sees them. In the Rosicrucian school, the names for things are usually given by function more than by description. Some people call, for example, the desire world the astral world because it sparkles. We call it the desire world because relative to humans, its function is desire, which is motivation. So for these talks, we're going to use the terms that are given by the Rosicrucian Fellowship. And I won't add any others from any other schools, because that, in a light introductory talk like this, that just leads to confusion. According to the spirit-matter pole, ascending from the lower part to the higher part, there is the chemical ether, the life ether, the light ether, and the reflecting ether. Now, since this is mostly, for most of you are already Rosicrucian students, this is going to be more of a review than it is going to be a thorough treatise on the ethers. Now, I have a website, and on that website there are at least 2 places where I can direct you to for several talks on what we're reviewing this evening. And if you're interested in that, let me know, and I can tell you where you can find them. Scott's already aware of where everything is. Now, the chemical ether approximates what material science calls energy. The chemical ether is the gateway between etheric energy and chemical matter. Physics is progressively coming closer to an understanding of how energy is condensed into particulate matter, and it agrees with mystics. For example, in the last couple of years, physicists at CERN laboratory in Europe have discovered what is called the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson, or boson, I don't know how to pronounce it, is what is responsible for energy becoming matter. And a physicist can describe for you, and they have done that, how energy becomes particulate matter. And you can go back and you can find in history Gnostics describing the same phenomenon, and the description between what the Gnostics teach and the physicists teach, it's astounding that it's the same, except the only difference is that for the Gnostic, it is not an abstract, a mental abstract thing. For them, it is a matter of observation, that they can literally see it. I'll try to look it up if anyone wants a reference of someone reading from a Gnostic text that does that. The ability to convert particulate matter back into energy, as we do with an atomic bomb or in a atomic fuel station or whatever we do, that can be found even further back in history. That mystics have talked about such thing. Now, condensing energy into matter and releasing it from matter, when that happens in the cosmos, That is, when this world is precipitated out of the ethers, that happens only at certain special times in the evolutionary creation. So the main ongoing activity of the chemical ether is accomplishing chemical transformations in matter. And this is done to change, sustain, and maintain form as a means of experience for the mineral life wave. Now, chemical ether also expresses different qualities of experience in different chemicals. We know that. You could almost have a psychology of the different elements on the atomic chart, because each one of them has a nature that is all of its own, and even the applications are all of its own. Rod said some very beautiful things about the nature of metals. Well, there are also things at the opposite side of the periodic chart with the halogens. And the halogens, we find they're the bad guys always. You know, all of the poisons that we use for killing plants and animals and things like that are usually things that use chlorine or fluorine or something like that. I don't want to get into that because I'm getting way out into the boonies with that. Now, because chemical ether is at the frontier between energy and matter, the polarization has to be very strong. The polarity of the chemical ether is very different from the polarity of the spirit-matter pole. And it is that way because both poles are active. If you take a bar magnet, which is an expression of chemical ether, both poles will repel a magnet of the same polarity. So in the spirit-matter pole, the spirit end is more active, but the matter end is more passive. So that's a big difference between the function of the chemical ether versus the spirit-matter pole. Now, in the human body, the chemical ether works closely with the life ether. And the life ether is where the matrix of vitality is in the physical world. And the chemical ether is sort of, I don't know how to say it any other way, it's interlaced with the life ether matrix. And so the chemical ether, as it's a tonal process, this is something we can't go into here, but it is a tonal process as well as what we call an electrical process or an electromagnetical process. Things are attracted into the physical body and repulsed from the physical body according to the tone of the keynote of the whole physical body. But then, in any rate, the function of the chemical ether is attraction and repulsion of things in the physical body. Food stuff that we need. The life ether in the etheric body is responsible for vitality. That's why it's called the life ether. Anything that we call living in this world that we see around us has to have an life ether vital body, or it won't live. Minerals don't have that. They don't grow. A plant which has only an etheric vital body and no desire body will grow as long as it lives. It never stops. There's no check on the life ether in a plant. However, with an animal or with a human, the function of motivation is there. And once the motivation clicks in, that puts a halt to the living and growing. A human stops growing somewhere between 14 and 21, and animals, when they reach what is called maturity, stops growing. So the life ether is all about building, maintaining, and propagating forms with vitality. A stone is always a stone, but a plant lives, and as long as it lives, it grows. Now, organic chemistry is different from inorganic chemistry. And it is because the organic chemistry was developed around the connection between the life ether and the chemical ether. I feel a little bit ashamed talking about these things because we have a master organic chemist here who is polite enough to not laugh at my sophomore presentation. So, because of the etheric matrix, the forms that organic chemistry forms are much more complex. And they have all of these bonds that can be broken and reattached that, like when it's strictly in the minerals, the reaction is done. But with organic chemistry, things can be done and redone and transformed into another way of doing things. And it's quite remarkable what organic chemistry really is. All right. Sometimes I get so lost in my notes, I don't know where I'm going. There's also more autonomy in an organism that has a vital body. It's not just a simple matter of chemistry. The types of bonds are more delicate. And everything happens more slowly because you're taking in two worlds. Yeah, you can denature organic chemicals, but still, even there, the complexity is such that it takes a longer time to do things. Now, polarity in the life ether is not as close or as strong as it is in the chemical ether. Polarity in life ether is expressed in more than just bonding. It is expressed in growth and in propagation. And because this physical world is what it is, when you get into the spiritual worlds, especially when you get into the transcendental worlds, what form there is, or the degree of form that there is caused by unification. In spirit, we form a group by unifying. But in matter, when we build a form, we do it by division. In cell growth, it's called mitosis. And in higher organisms, the energy is divided. Part of it is directed at one pole in humans, to the sperm, and part of it is developed, goes into the ovum. So mitosis is an internal division. It's sort of like the internal creativity of life spirit, except that it produces an external form. Within the life spirit, the internalization or the splitting within is very different. So cells divide, and as they divide, there is growth until something checks that growth. In propagation, polarity is expressed in a manner that is a little bit different from growth. Like in the lower life forms, like amoebas and euglenas and things like that, propagation is accomplished by self-division. The organism is so simple it just splits in half, and each half recoups to being a new individual. Sometimes one half dies, and otherwise it would be uncontrolled growth, but that also happens sometimes. In higher life, there is a polar specialization in half cells like the sperm and like the ova. It is more a difference in focus that causes the split into the half cell than it is an internal division. But at any rate, we can see that polarity in the life ether is different from polarity in the chemical ether, and one of the differences is that the connection is more loose. There is beyond the life ether forms, there is a flux. And there is a flux of life ether that flows through the forms and vitalizes it. It's often called by the world animal magnetism. It has not much, a little relationship to electromagnetism, which is in the chemical ether, but it's a totally different thing. If a person has a strong vital body, especially in the life ether, and that individual has enough sensitivity and self-control, they can manipulate ethers. You can see that in some people. Cats like being petted by some people, but not so much by other people, because some people have more vital energy that they're radiating. And you can do magnetic healing. When Max Heindel was alive, they used to have summer schools that were real summer schools where people were taught to do magnetic healing and bring about almost seemingly miraculous changes in people by the means of it. If you have etheric vision, you can see if there is stagnant ether. That flux sometimes gets stagnated, especially if we are selfish and we think about ourselves in food and eat more and more and more. The fluidity is lost in the ethers and they become dark and miasmatic and they almost become like jelly. And if a person has a strong vital body, they can actually draw it off, the miasmic ether. And if a person is even stronger, when the miasmatic ether has been drawn off, they can give a charge of their own to the individual. When I lived at Mount Ecclesia, I used to work on concrete floors all day, and I took pride in the amount of work that I could do, and that pride manifested itself as cramps. And I shared a little cabin down in Gum Grove, if you know where that is, with a man who was quite remarkable. I would wake up in the night with screaming cramps, and he would come to my side of the of the cabin, and he would just lay his hands on the calves of my legs, and he would draw the cramps off and flush them down the water. He took the ethers out of there. There was no doubt about the ethers in my consciousness at that point. Now the chemical and the life ethers are called biological ethers because they're necessary for biological continuance in this plane. The two other ethers are called soul ethers, and they are the light ether and the reflecting ether, which have higher functions. Now the poles of the life ether are loose. They're not so loose as to be indefinite, but they are loose enough that they're capable of change, that the polarization can even be changed. There are a lot of animals, most of them are fish, like for example in the streams of the Sierras in Mexico, there is a fish where all of the fish are female until it's mating time, and then the vital body of the fish causes a change, and some of the fish become male, and they fertilize the eggs, and then they go back to being female again. I'll let the male chauvinists think what they want about that one, as far as males and females are concerned. So when we get to the light ether, which is the next one up and the first one of the soul ethers, the polarity is even more divergent, and it's even weaker. Now the positive pole in plants and in cold-blooded animals drives the circulation by being directed by sunlight, circulates everything. Like warm-blooded, cold-blooded animals have to lie in the sun to have their energy. Plant juices or saps are moved by the sun striking them at a certain angle. A lot of it has to do with angle. Now, the negative pole of the light ether is more passive. It's more like the higher spiritual worlds. And it takes things in sense perception. It's also responsible for coloration. Now, the divergence between the two poles of the light ether is enough so that one would wonder how they are even from the same source. And when you get to the reflecting ether, the divergence between the two poles is so great that some early mystics thought that the two poles were separate substances. And for that reason, they had a quintessence rather than a tetraessence. So the positive pole of the reflecting ether is for transmitting thought. And the function of the negative pole is memory. That very marvelous memory that retains everything in pictorial form. Now it's a fact that the polarity is so split and divided that there are people who are mnemonists. You can open up a phone book before them. It's hard to find a phone book these days. And they'll just scan down the phone book, and then 15 minutes later you ask them and they can tell you every name in the phone book. And they do it all pictorially. They find a pictorial correlative. But mnemonists, when they're functioning in the mnemonistic mode, have a very hard time to ratiocinate. And the same thing is true for many people who are at the positive pole. They're excellent logicians, but they don't focus on memory. And some of them even think that imagination, which is more associated with the negative pole, is not a healthy thing. So there would be no intellectual activity without thought and memory. There would be no science, no philosophy, no literature, because we wouldn't be able to bring the truth that is manifest in thoughts that get radiated to the I'm blanking out here, my body is very tired, to the reflecting ether. They reflect what's happening in the mind and the higher levels. Now the term soul ethers means more than facilitating soulful activities like thinking. It means soul itself. In Christian mysticism, the word soul means the essence of experience. It is the result of the spiritualization of matter through vigorous experience. Now, since the ethers facilitate action, the soul material that is generated is in and about action. It's called intellectual soul. And intellectual soul has to do with an understanding of being attracted or repulsed to a certain kind of behavior because of experience. The polarity even carries into the soul nature itself. It's called intellectual soul because when it is absorbed in the spirit, in the threefold spirit, it assimilates to the life spirit. And since the time of the Greeks, the name for the life spirit was called the intellect with a capital I, and that's why it's called intellectual soul. Now, through actions, we develop sympathies and antipathies, and that's what intellectual soul is all about. That's the quality of intellectual soul. So, we can see that the ethers, as we see them, convey things into and out of the chemical world and the inner worlds. Relative to the desire world and the world of thought, they are deeper in, how would you say it, concretion. Now, the deeper one goes into concretion, or the further one goes down the spirit-matter pole, the greater the need there is for specialization. Now, in the worlds of pure spirit, there is no specialization. Everything is universal. That's why altruism that comes from the life spirit, which is Christ love, you might say, is universal. Everything is universal. Now, in order to convey things into the chemical subdivision and to function in physical bodies, each of the ethers has to specialize to serve the realm that it serves. I don't know how to say it. The chemical ether is obviously specializes exclusively polarity to the chemical subdivision of the physical world. It does nothing else. The life ether dedicates and specializes its polarity to vitality and to the ethers themselves. The life ether represents the ethers more than anything else because that's the function of the ethers is light, is life. The light ether specializes itself to the desire world. So it's a special kind of polarity. And the work of the desire world is motivation. So it's not surprising that it would drive the fluids, either the blood or the sap or something like that. And at the other pole, the negative pole of the light ether is for color. Coloration that takes place in the physical bodies of plants, animals, and humans is precipitated through the negative pole of the life ether. So we can see that there is that specialized affinity of light ether with the desire world. And very obviously, the reflecting ether is a specialization from the world of thought, from the concrete mind. In fact, there is a special resonance between the concrete mind. It can even bypass, to some extent, the function of desire, and thoughts can be put right into the reflecting ether of the vital body, and they can be ramified there, which is part of the work of the reflecting ether. If a person has a soul body that is rich in light ether, it is because they have used the blood to drive themselves to acts of service. It is in service, especially self-forgetting service, that we attract the light ether to us so that we will have perception in the inner worlds. If a person is rich in reflecting ether, it is a person who has been thoughtful. And that thoughtfulness is not just thinking about things, it is what we call being a thoughtful individual. And it is thinking of such a way that something can be done for the sake of the good. So we can see that our soul development has a lot to do with polarization in this way. Now that's about all I have to offer tonight, but I hope it gives some added understanding or some impetus to studying the ethers more and trying to see it in the world around us. That's why we have these schools. We have these schools to share things and especially share enthusiasm so that we can work on our spiritual lives more. So we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase my love for thee so that I may serve thee better from day to day. let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions?
I didn't fall asleep. I stopped at Willie's today and I got sunflower seeds, plain raw,
Okay.
unsalted, unroasted.
Okay. Yes.
I was going to ask this question about the reflecting ether, but I guess it might apply to the others. The polarities, or the two poles, or either pole, I should say, operate more or less independently of the other?
Yeah, the further...
Must they each feed the other? And the one I was thinking of was, in order to use your intellect, do you have to have memories as just for the mill? Or can you just...
To some extent...
Right off the bat?
Yeah, to some extent, the two poles cannot be separated from each other, but you can put more emphasis on one than the other, so that in effect it almost seems like you're working at one pole exclusively. And in some organisms, some of those functions are at different times are more in one pole than another. For example, if a plant is making flowers and it's bringing out coloration in that way, that negative pole of the light ether is active. That's one of the only times that it's really active, since plants don't really have sense perception the way we have it. And, you know, there's a specialization in a plant. A flower is very much a specialization. In us, even our senses are specializations.
Morphic fields, have you heard that term?
Morphogenic fields, yes. That's the life ether. What he's talking about is a British biologist named Rupert Sheldrake did experiments in which he had very sensitive circuits. I think they're called Wheatstone bridges, that he could measure fields around plants. And he found that there were fields around young seedling plants, and that those fields diminished, and as they diminished, the plant grew. And from this he concluded that there was a morphogenic field. He didn't use the word ethers. He knew about the word ethers because he had studied in India. And from this he concluded that there was a morphogenic field. He was only seeing the breakdown of that field, because with electronics you can only see things when they're in decay, not when they're actually living. So to some extent he may even have stunted his plants a little bit by doing the experiments. And this caused a big row in the biological community. And this was considered mysticism, and it was not considered science. And as a consequence, he lost all of his funding. And there was, I don't know if it's still so, a prize of $1 million to anyone who could have a definitive experiment that would disprove or prove the existence of morphogenic fields. And I don't think that prize has ever been claimed by anyone yet. Interesting thing is, he went into other things. He went into what we might call New Age experiments. He did experiments about dogs knowing when their masters are coming home, and they had cameras in people's houses, and then they had people come home at hours when they didn't normally come home, but the dog knew that the person was coming home. They could tell by the activity. And another experiment he did is one that lecherous people like myself know is true. He did experiments to show that people know when somebody is watching them. In my younger days, I have seen a lot of women pull down their blouses over their fannies because I was looking at them in not the right way. And I didn't need Rupert Sheldrake to tell me, to shame me in my behavior. Any other questions?
Oh, he also talked like a wolf den. A mother wolf might be 20 miles away, and if something's messing with the wolf
Yes.
pups,
Yeah.
somehow, she knows something.
Yeah.
And it's some kind of morphic
Yeah, yeah,
communication.
yeah.
It's so interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
So Amy, did you see how I was balancing everything here and most of the time it didn't fall?
I did